Hey, welcome back. Getting ready to do another video. Now today, I'm going to be reacting to the reality of slavery in America and everywhere else. I can guarantee you whoever made this video is uninformed about slavery. And they're going to try to use, oh yeah, black people keep complaining about slavery, whoop-de-whoop-de-whoop-de-whoop-de-woo. Keep in mind before we watch this video that slavery was still bad in the Americas. What happened to black people in America was screwed up. But keep in mind, I think mostly black people don't, I don't know if most black people, I think some black people don't get this part. A lot do, but some don't. It's not just the slavery, it's what happened after slavery. We weren't welcomed into society fair. And we still aren't being welcomed into society fair. So, slavery was a sin from what I'm reading right now. And thanks for Biden to acknowledging that. Trump would never acknowledge it. Let's play it. Alright, let's hop right into it. Let's get it, let's go.
The original sin of slavery.
The original sin of slavery. Today, Americans are taught when it comes to slavery, America was the worst.
The Atlantic slave trade from Africa to the Americas was different from any other type of slavery.
The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
American slavery was worse because...
Okay, that he's wrong. I will say that with confidence. They didn't create slavery. Slavery has existed since the dawn of time. That is absolutely 1,000% wrong. Our lawmakers have to be careful, man. I think like our lawmakers have to be careful. When you speak on something, make sure you know what you're talking about.
The slaves were reduced to property. They were chattel property. No other system of slavery did that except American slavery.
That's
okay. They're pointing out people that are okay. He's wrong too. The whole point of slavery is to be property. Okay.
complete nonsense. Wilfred Riley is a political science professor and author of Lies My Liberal Teachers Told Me.
Generational slavery, like if you're the son of a slave, you're a slave, that was extraordinarily common. Slavery around the world was slavery.
Books like this, Unfinished Nation.
Yeah.
Slaves in Africa were kept unfree only for a fixed term.
No, is the short answer. Most of the slaves taken by these sort of players would be either kept as slaves for their entire life or, more likely, sold to the whites and the Arabs in 2 years.
That's not true. So, like the part where they were sold to the whites and Arabs were absolutely true. That happened automatically when they captured some of the slaves. But the part where in Africa, slavery was indentured servitude. It was the same way in Rome. It was the same way in a lot of places. You went to certain places and you were a slave for a certain period of time, and then you could actually win your freedom. And I think it was Rome where, like, if you went into slavery and you won in the Colosseums, like you consistently won battles in the Colosseums, you could be freed that way too. I mean, there was many ways to get freed. But there were places, I think in like Arab nations, the Americas, where you remained a slave your entire life. But Africa, no. The majority of countries, there are some, but the majority believed in indentured servitude. You were a slave for a certain period of time, and you could earn your freedom. You could even go back to your family too. So the guy's right and wrong. So.
Today, partly thanks to the New York Times 1619 Project, students are taught that America's slavery was unlike anything that existed before.
Keep in mind, like, I like when they talk about slavery and don't tell all the details. The 1619 Project is not taught in any elementary school. It's not taught in any school besides college level teachings. Like, the whole 1619 critical race theory, it's only taught on the college level. It is only taught there. It's not taught anywhere else. The history of slavery is barely taught at all in schools. It's taught, but it's barely taught. It's not taught to the point where people understand how graphic it was. However, though, it's also taught on the critical race level, I think, in my opinion, to be fair to this, a little too graphic. And that sounds weird to say, but it's like, I think like there were parts of slavery that were graphic, but then there's a little bit of exaggeration that's happening sometimes. Like the exaggeration part is like the whole concept that that whites are born racist. Like babies are born racist. No, you're taught that shit, and it takes away from the problem. But the graphic part of slavery they don't talk about is that there were whites that ate blacks. That happened. That's what a picnic was. There were whites in the South that get ground together in bands to go and lynch blacks. That happened. That stuff was not talked about in school when I was in elementary school. The lynching part, that wasn't taught. But, oh well, let's keep going.
We're the worst society ever. We've done things that no one else has ever done. And sometimes there's nothing wrong with acknowledging your historical mistakes. I mean, I'm black, Irish, a bit Native American, at least per the family lore. I mean, those are three peoples that have experienced a great deal historically. Nothing wrong with acknowledging that. But it's extremely odd to focus only on the negatives of your society and to exaggerate those.
Americans are taught that slavers caught people in Africa and shipped them here. But few are taught that most slaves were not shipped to the United States.
Between 10.7 million and 12 million slaves from Africa went to the New World. We got a little under 400,000.
Under 400,000.
Yes, that's very true. However, though, does that take away from Jim Crow and the things that happened later? Now, granted, we're going to talk strictly about slavery, right? But I just want this question to be answered. And all those places on this map that they've named right now, right, where the African diaspora has happened, give me one area that is developed. It's almost as if every area that they're pointing towards on the map right now was disenfranchised in some way. Where blacks stay, it's disenfranchised in some way. How do you explain that? How do you explain that? Why is the African continent so disenfranchised? Started out one of the greatest. At Egypt, the Kush empires, Ethiopia, these were some of the first empires to exist, but now it's the most poorest country. It was robbed. It was robbed of something. And to be fair, who screwed everybody over? Everyone did. Who screwed blacks over? Everyone did. Point blank, period.
Out of 10 million.
The extreme focus on slavery in the United States, why did that happen? One reason is that a lot of black people survived here. Slavery was harsh, but it's a lot less harsh than clearing the Brazilian jungle.
All right, but American blacks are at a disadvantage. They have less capital, financial and educational capital. What's the harm in pointing out how abusive white people were?
The harm is that pointing out how abusive white people were is not going to get black Americans any more capital. Most of the problems in the modern black community don't have anything to do with historical ethnic conflict 160 years ago.
The Great Society asked...
Yeah, but the discussion is all people want. If the discussion happens, it leans to more empathy, and that empathy could lean to more capital. He's wrong. Like, that empathy could lean to people actually deciding, like, hey, maybe we should do something to help the black community. But they, like, right now, they have no empathy. That's why they want to roll back on programs that help black people. And it's funny is, I was going to say DEI, but DEI is not specifically tailored for black people. It's for everybody. There's not a single person that couldn't benefit from a DEI program. We have elderly people that need to be protected. We have disabled people that need to be protected. But those things are rolled back on because they think it's for black people. Whatever.
Not how much, but how good. Riley says most of the problems began when welfare began.
Crime in the black community, every time I've tried to break this out, increased about 800% between, say, 1963 and 1993.
Oh my God, dude. No, man. Jim Crow caused it. Jim Crow, it started with Jim Crow. Jim Crow and the mindsets that whites had towards blacks when they built anything they built. Because prior to all this, when blacks were building civilizations, not building civilizations, but towns, they were burned to the ground. Rosewood, Tulsa, Black Wall Street, there's so many. Like, I read about so many of them that were burned to the ground just because white folks didn't like the fact that blacks could possibly be doing better than them. And that stuff isn't heard about. Like, now, the same communities that were burned to the ground, if you go into it now, a lot of them are disenfranchised communities where there aren't a lot of crime happening. Just to point that out. So 800%, you can't just say it's the welfare state that caused it. It's taking responsibility off all the problems. Welfare did add a little bit to it, but definitely it was not the only problem.
Racism didn't increase between 1960 and the modern era. You're looking at the impacts of the Great Society, the welfare programs.
Riley argues it's better to teach the truth, that almost every society had slavery.
It's true.
The Aztecs, the Persians,
It's true.
Egyptians,
It's true.
Greeks, Romans. Romans, Vikings, and most of all, the Arab world.
The Arabs were probably history's premier slave traders.
Sometimes they captured poor whites from Slavic countries.
That's
The
true.
Muslims, many of whom were dark-skinned or even black, took so many blonde slaves out of this region that they gave the word Slav, slave, to the global slave population.
Many slaves were forced into harems.
Sexual slavery was very much a part of slavery. Like if your group was defeated in war, the men would probably just be killed or they'd be sold as farmhands. The women would often be sold as harem girls or prostitutes.
More than 1 million Europeans were enslaved, but Muslim slave traders took more people from Africa.
The Arabs targeting Africa took out about 17 million people.
The British and then the Americans were the rare people who moved to abolish slavery.
So yeah, the British Navy, in a story almost no one now knows, sank something like 1,600 slave ships. It freed.
But don't ever get it twisted. The Americas were not a part of that. It was just the British. It was just the British. The British constantly argued with the Americans to get rid of slavery. One of the slaves, there's a movie that you got to read about. It's called a movie that you guys should watch. It's called Amistad, and in that movie, it kind of describes Tucapia. It's something. It was a slave fortress. I think it was in Guyana. I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was in Guyana, and that slave fortress existed in a sense because the Americans would allow it. The Americans didn't fully want to get rid of it, and the British found it and they sunk it. Yeah.
150,000 people that were enslaved at the time.
Because the Brits objected for moral reasons.
Yeah, they had enough of it.
Saudi Arabia only abolished the slave trade relatively recently.
Yeah.
Well, it's another inconvenient fact, right?
The Global Slavery Index has
Keep in mind, the Saudi Arabians and the Arabs don't consider themselves as black people. Because they try to say they were darker skinned, browner skinned. You say that to a Saudi Arabian, they will not consider themselves black. They don't consider themselves that. Not even just Saudi Arabian. The Arabs at the time did not consider themselves African or black at all, just to make sure that's clear. Because it sounded like he was trying to say that they were Africans that sold Africans, which that did happen. But you're saying the Arabs were the greatest when it came to slave trade? Well, yeah, so were the Christians. But, I'm just not trying to let them throw salt in all one direction when everyone played a role in this.
estimates that even now, although slavery is officially illegal, there are more than 700,000 slaves in Saudi Arabia.
Where there were no Westerners, you'd have a lot of slavery for a long time. And you do.
American slavery was horrible, but it wasn't unique. Our culture would be healthier if we learned about that. And schools dwelling on America's evils hasn't helped Americans get over them. Gallup.
To admit that it was horrible is just hilarious to me. It's just hilarious to me because that's all we want. Like, most people don't even think it was horrible. Do you know some people that, like, if you read about the Daughters of the Confederacy and what they did to convince the South that slavery wasn't even really that bad, that like there's some people that are convinced that slaves liked being enslaved. Like, there are literally some people in America that believe that shit.
Polls show that after schools started focusing on oppression, race relations got worse.
Of course.
The idea of generational slavery.
Because you've lied for generations about what happened. Had you have just told the story the way the story needed to be, a lot of people wouldn't be upset. A lot of people wouldn't be upset. Like, people are upset. And keep in mind, again, like CRT, critical race theory, is not taught in elementary schools. You will not find that anywhere. It is taught on the college level. So when people get to college and learn everything that happened, they're so irritated because they're like, where was all this history in high school?
The idea of slave trading, none of that was unique to America. And another thing, you don't need radicalism to critique the worst excesses of an existing system. All you need is incrementalism and honesty.
In a few weeks, I'll post a video about another of Riley's myths.
Lies, my
the
liberty.
claim that before Columbus, the native people were kind stewards of the environment.
I know every rock and tree and creature has a life, has a spirit, has a name.
To make sure you get that video, subscribe.
It's funny to me because it's like they think that we don't know that. They think that we don't know that it wasn't all fine, dandy, and roses for the other side. But still, whites came over and massacred them. I don't even want to... Oh my God. Christopher Columbus was a horrible man. Quit trying to take anything off of that. He was a horrible man. He came and mutilated the people that were there. That's what he did. Yeah, that's what he did. Like, had you have never landed on there would have never been any kind of quote-unquote thought process. There would never been any quote-unquote of a war. No, his goal when he came over there was to obliterate the people, and he did it. He did it. He did it. He did it. Anyways. All right, y'all. Peace.